What if behind every misfortune there wasn't chance, but a dark presence that feeds on human suffering? Have you ever stopped to think that not every tragedy is born of chance, nor is every misfortune a simple consequence of fate? What if there were an ancient, cunning, invisible force, moving the pieces of chaos, sowing destruction where there should be peace? The Bible speaks of this, but few truly understand what lies behind the ruins of the human soul. Misfortune, a word that carries weight, pain, and the echo of something beyond control. It's the moment when everything you've built crumbles, when the ground disappears, and the silence seems to mock your faith. But what if that silence wasn't empty? What if behind it there was laughter, the cold, discreet laughter of an entity that has existed since the beginning, that knew humankind even before humankind learned to cry? According to the Bible, evil doesn't arise from nothing. It has a purpose, a form, and above all, a strategy. Misfortune is one of the enemy's most effective weapons because it destroys from the inside out. It not only wounds the body, but corrodes faith, distorts hope, and transforms doubt into a permanent dwelling place. When life seems to crumble, the demon behind the misfortune isn't only interested in what you lose, he wants what's inside you, your trust in God. How many times have you seen someone lose everything and, along with what they lost, also lose their faith? That's when the adversary wins, because his goal was never the tragedy itself, but your reaction to it. He uses suffering as bait and despair as a chain. And while man curses the heavens, he laughs in the shadows, feeding on fear, guilt, and disbelief. The Bible describes Satan as the accuser, the destroyer, the thief of purposes. He is not satisfied with causing pain. He wants to distort its meaning. And that is what transforms misfortune into something spiritual, when suffering ceases to be merely pain and becomes condemnation. The enemy whispers, "God has forgotten you." And many believe it. It is at that moment that the true attack happens, when the mind yields, when the heart doubts, when the spirit weakens. But understand this: every misfortune has an invisible point of origin. It begins in the soul before manifesting in the world. A broken home, a collapsing mind, an unexplained illness. None of this is purely physical. The Bible shows that there is an unseen battle, and it is in this battle that the demon of misfortune acts, silently, patiently, waiting for the right opening. He doesn't need to appear, he only needs to influence. He feeds on anger, resentment, fear, and self-pity. Therefore, when something in your life seems to crumble, the question is not why me, but what is this trying to teach me? Because the enemy wants you to look only at the chaos, not the purpose. He wants you to see misfortune where God may be building liberation. What the devil destroys, God can transform, but only if man perceives the spiritual battle that surrounds him. And perhaps your misfortune is not the end, but the field where this war is happening right now. The field where your faith will be tested, your patience will be refined, and your soul will reveal which side it is truly on. The question is, can you see beyond what evil wants to show you? Because the true power of misfortune lies not in what it takes from you, but in what it tries to prevent you from discovering. And that's where the mystery begins to unfold. If everything you've heard so far has affected you, if this idea that there's something invisible behind your falls has made you think, then this is where I ask you something simple but powerful. Let your like right now. It's not just a gesture, it's a sign that you understand what's being revealed here. It's your way of saying, I want to understand more. I don't accept the spiritual deception that surrounds me. Comment below what you feel when everything starts to go wrong, when it seems like there's a force pulling you down. Do you think it's a coincidence? Or have you noticed signs of something bigger acting in the shadows of your life? Your words can awaken someone who is blinded by their own pain. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe now, because what comes next is profound. We're going to open the scriptures and reveal how this spirit operates, how it infiltrates human tragedies, and what God says about overcoming this force that feeds on misfortune. Take a deep breath, because the next step is no longer theory, it's revelation. There are times when the world seems to collapse all at once. You look around and everything you've built with so much effort begins to crumble. Relationships, finances, health, inner peace. And the worst part isn't losing what you have, it's losing your sense of purpose. Because in the midst of chaos, the sky seems silent. No answers, no voices, no explanations. Just silence. A silence that weighs heavily, that suffocates, that makes a person doubt whether their prayers still reach them or if they've already been forgotten in the void. That's where the enemy acts. Not when you fall, but when you believe that God let you fall alone. The silence of God is the space the adversary tries to fill. When heaven doesn't speak, hell whispers. And what it says isn't a shout, it's an insinuation. It doesn't need to shout to destroy you, it just needs to plant the right doubt. God has abandoned you. None of this has any purpose. Your faith is useless. These phrases echo in weary minds, in wounded souls. The demon behind misfortune doesn't arrive with thunder, it arrives with thoughts. It speaks with your own voice. It clothes your conscience and convinces you that you are thinking alone. The Bible shows this from the beginning. When Adam and Eve heard the serpent, the sound didn't come from outside. It was within their minds that the voice became real. The strategy hasn't changed. Evil doesn't need to appear, it only needs to convince. And when man, amidst tragedy, begins to doubt God's love, the enemy laughs. His laughter isn't loud, it's cold, disguised as logic. Because evil is rational, it disguises itself as understanding. It makes you believe you are waking up to reality, when in truth you are falling asleep in illusion. Think about your own struggles, that moment when you asked for help and nothing happened. The exam results worsened, the bill came due, someone betrayed you, a friend disappeared. The enemy knows that despair is an open door. He doesn't need to push, he enters when you stop resisting. And God's silence, which should lead you to faith, becomes fuel for disbelief. That's when the breach opens. Misfortune is the curtain, but the stage is your soul. It is there that the enemy plays his part day after day. He knows that man is most fragile when he is confused, and chaos, suffering, loss are the perfect breeding ground for the poison of doubt to germinate. The enemy doesn't want to destroy your house. He wants to see you destroying it with your own hands. He wants your pain to turn into resentment, your suffering to become an accusation against the Creator himself. Because while you question, where is God? He convinces you that God never was. And when the enemy's laughter echoes, it's a sign that someone believed his lies. Tragedy, however cruel, is not a victory for evil. Victory comes when man loses faith in the midst of tragedy, when he stops praying, when he abandons the altar, when he decides to resolve things with his own strength. The devil doesn't need to take everything from you. He only needs to take away your trust in God, and the rest falls apart on its own. Remember Job? He lost his children, possessions, health, and friends. Everything crumbled. But what Satan really wanted wasn't Job's cattle, house, or body. He wanted his heart. He wanted to hear a blasphemy, a word of rebellion from his mouth, and that's what he still seeks today. He feeds on the sound of murmuring. When a man curses his own day, the enemy feeds. When someone says, God has forgotten me, he grows stronger. But there is something he fears, the silence of the righteous, the silence of those who do not understand but trust, the silence of those who weep but do not curse. Because this silence is not empty, it is faith without words. And hell hates that, because while man continues to believe even without seeing, the enemy's laughter turns to despair. Understand this. God's silence is not absence, it's a test. It's the interval between the request and the miracle. It's the moment when he observes what you do when you no longer hear his voice. And it is precisely there that the enemy tries to deceive you, pretending to dominate the scene. He makes you look at the chaos and forget that God is still in control. He presents himself as the Lord of the moment, but he is only a passing actor. Misfortune is the stage where faith is proven, not the end of the story. And it is in this invisible realm that many lose the war without realizing it. When everything is crumbling, the first reaction is to try to understand. Man wants explanations, wants logic, wants meaning. But the spiritual is not understood with the mind, it is discerned with the spirit. And that is where the enemy defeats you, when you try to rationalize what can only be overcome in prayer. He transforms your intelligence into a prison, your reason into a wall. How many times have you tried to solve something on your own that only God could move? How many times have you transformed your pain into anger, your waiting into giving up? It is at this point that the enemy's laughter grows loudest, because he knows that when you give up, he no longer needs to fight against you. You already do the work for him. But there's something that changes the game, recognizing the breach. The breach is the moment when the soul distances itself from faith. It could be a trauma, a disappointment, a loss. It's when you feel that God has become distant, but in reality, it was you who took a step back. The enemy notices and occupies the space. And while man indulges in self-pity, evil settles in, discreetly, permanently. But there is one truth that hell cannot erase. God may be silent, but he is never absent. He observes, he measures, he allows, and then intervenes at the right moment. The enemy laughs too soon. He laughs because he does not know the timing of the Almighty. He laughs because he believes that human suffering is victory, but ignores that in every tear God sows strength. The enemy's laughter is the echo of spiritual ignorance. He believes he can conquer faith, but true faith is born in silence. And when a person, even wounded, still prays, still believes, still rises, hell falls silent. Therefore, before cursing God's silence, realize what is happening around you. Perhaps what seems like abandonment is the field where your faith is being refined. Perhaps your pain is preparation for something greater. And perhaps the misfortune that wounded you is the very instrument that will reveal it to you. Now tell me, how many times have you felt this silence? How many times has it seemed like God turned away from you when you needed him most? Comment below if you've ever experienced something like this. Write just one sentence. I have already heard the silence of God. This phrase is your declaration of war against the enemy. Because every time someone writes it, the laughter of hell is silenced a little more. The enemy never acts directly. He hides behind chaos, disguises himself in the unexpected, and makes suffering a trap. Misfortune, when it arrives, rarely has its origin written on it. It comes like a wind that knocks down, like a consuming loss, like a night that never ends. And it is at that very moment, when the heart is weak and man begins to doubt, that the adversary whispers, "Where is your God now?" This was the case with Job, an upright man, fearing the Lord, surrounded by blessings, family, health, and honor, until heaven allowed evil to approach, not to destroy him, but to expose what was hidden, to reveal whether Job's faith was dependent on gifts or sustained by love. The enemy's ancient strategy begins like this. He doesn't create misfortune, he instrumentalizes it. He takes what is earthly, pain, loss, confusion, and transforms it into a spiritual weapon. It makes man look up and feel that God has abandoned him, when in fact heaven is silently watching, allowing the test that purifies the spirit. When Job's life collapsed, he lost everything: children, possessions, health, reputation. But notice, Satan did not touch Job without divine permission. This is fundamental. There is a limit imposed by the Creator himself. Evil does not reign freely. It is a rebellious servant, still obeying the voice that created it. Job's suffering was not punishment, it was purpose. An invisible battlefield between doubt and faith, between the enemy's laughter and the patience of a man who refused to curse God's name. And here is the truth that many cannot bear to hear. Misfortune is the mirror of spiritual warfare. When everything goes wrong, it's not just bad luck, fate, or coincidence, it's contested territory. The enemy uses misfortune to invert divine logic. He tries to make man think that suffering is a sign of rejection, when in reality it is a process of refinement. He wants you to believe that God has forgotten you, when in fact heaven observes you in silence, because the test is yours. He wants you to murmur, blaspheme, give up, because he knows that a man who resists in pain is a threat to hell. Job resisted, and that is what hell fears most. Someone who does not bow down even when they lose everything. There is something profound in this mystery. Satan has no power to create, only to corrupt. He takes what is good and distorts it. He takes blessing and turns it into a snare. He takes the time of waiting and turns it into despair. And when man falls into this mental trap, the adversary laughs, because he knows he doesn't need to touch the body if he can corrupt the mind. This is the ancient strategy. It's not just about material destruction, but about manipulating meaning. He makes you see tragedy where God is shaping growth. He makes you call what heaven calls refinement a misfortune. Notice that throughout the book of Job, the enemy speaks little. He acts and remains silent, because silence is his weapon. The noise is within man. These are thoughts of rebellion, of disbelief, of why me? The battlefield is not outside, it is inside. It is the heart that becomes the altar or the minefield. The question is not why evil happened, but what it will generate in you. Will it distance you from God or bring you closer to Him? And this continues to this day. The adversary continues to apply the same strategy because it works. He inflicts losses and observes. He lights the fire and watches. He doesn't just want to see man suffer. He wants to see man give up his faith. He wants the despair that produces estrangement. He knows that a broken heart that still worships is an act of war against hell. That's why he tries to transform pain into doubt. But the Bible shows that even suffering has an owner. No tear is wasted. No desert is in vain. The enemy may touch the flesh, but he cannot steal the promise. He may steal the good, but he cannot erase the purpose. He may mock the fall, but he cannot prevent the resurrection. And the more he tries to destroy, the more God uses the very blow as a stepping stone to redemption. This is how the old tactic unfolds, misfortune as spiritual theater. God allows evil to act, not because he is cruel, but because judgment and mercy coexist on the same throne. Pain exposes what comfort hides, and that is why many only know the voice of God when the ground opens up. Hell calls this defeat. Heaven calls it an encounter. And perhaps at this moment you are in the midst of this silent war, looking up and asking, why? The enemy wants this question to push you away, but God wants it to draw you closer. Because when man asks sincerely, heaven answers with revelation. Job didn't understand at first, but in the end he said, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. The purpose of suffering was not to destroy Job, it was to make him see God up close. So stop and think. What hell tried to use against you, God can transform into a weapon of faith. What the enemy called misfortune, heaven is using as a testimony. And perhaps your story is being written now amidst the chaos, as was Job's. a plot in which evil is permitted only so that God's glory may be revealed in the end. I want to know what you think about this. Do you believe that evil acts with divine permission? That there is purpose, even in suffering? Write the following phrase in the comments now: "My pain has a purpose," to show that you understand the spiritual power that exists even in the darkest moments. There is a hidden power that acts when chaos reigns, and it doesn't come with horns or visible fire. It manifests itself silently, within the mind, in the weary heart, in words spoken in despair. It's what the scriptures call the thief, the spirit that comes to kill, steal, and destroy, as it is written in John 10:10. This is not just a well-known verse, it is a spiritual revelation about the most insidious enemy that exists, the demon of misfortune. He doesn't arrive announcing destruction. He whispers, he sows, he plants small cracks until the edifice of the soul begins to crumble. He is the spirit of ruin, confusion, and despair, and his function is one: to disintegrate the divine purpose of human life, to fragment everything that God builds, until man loses the sense of his own path. This spirit doesn't only attack with external tragedies, it infiltrates the emotional structure, feeds on fear, and grows with resentment. It doesn't need to destroy all at once. It prefers to corrode slowly. When a family begins to divide, when love cools, when the heart loses faith, the spirit of misfortune is at work. It disguises itself as routine, disappointment, bad luck. And the most dangerous thing is that often it goes unrecognized, because its greatest skill is making itself seem natural. It transforms the abnormal into the commonplace, the spiritual into the psychological, the attack into coincidence. But the Bible is clear: there is a spiritual thief at work. Jesus identified him not as a metaphor, but as a real entity, a destructive power that invades, steals, and destroys, and his field of action is vast. He enters where there is a breach, where there is negative talk, where there is resentment, envy, and murmuring. He feeds on the spiritual energy that man himself releases when he abandons faith. It is the cycle of ruin. First, the enemy whispers that God has fallen silent. Then, he makes man doubt. Finally, he transforms that doubt into despair. And despair is the altar where the spirit of misfortune reigns. Think about the moments when everything seemed to fall apart, not just what happened outside, but inside you. That weight that tightens your chest, the thought that nothing is worthwhile anymore, the feeling that there is no way out. This is not just sadness, it is spiritual warfare. The demon of misfortune works to break the axis of faith. He knows that if man loses hope, he loses everything. It is an entity with a specific function: to extinguish the inner light, to break the link with purpose. He acts on weary minds, in divided houses, in homes filled with silence. He makes people believe that suffering is the end, when in reality it is only the beginning of manipulation. The spirit of misfortune is the same one that acted upon the Gadarenes, the same one that led multitudes to plunge into spiritual abysses. It is not content with wounding, it wants to annihilate. It wants to transform men into shadows of themselves. And the most frightening thing is that it doesn't come in a grotesque form. It comes as discouragement, as apathy, as resignation. It enters when someone says, "I can't take it anymore." It feeds on phrases like that. Every word of defeat is an invitation, every complaint an opening. It is the demon that operates through language, thoughts, the atmosphere we create. Today, it manifests itself in cities, in families, on social media. It sows comparison, envy, a sense of inadequacy. It convinces modern man that failure is inevitable. It makes women believe they are alone. It makes young people lose their sense of direction. It takes what was merely sadness and transforms it into spiritual ruin. The demon of misfortune is the saboteur of destiny. Its pleasure is to see dreams shattered, promises forgotten, prayers interrupted. It doesn't need to kill physically. It is enough that man gives up the fight. And there's something few realize. This spirit doesn't enter by force, it enters by consent. When man begins to agree with evil, even without realizing it, he gives it authority. When he accepts fear as a companion, when he nurtures resentment, when he speaks more of darkness than of light, he's signing an invisible pact with ruin. Spiritual misfortune doesn't begin from the outside. It begins from within, at the very moment when man ceases to believe that God can still change history. But the sacred text continues. Jesus said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Do you see the contrast? The function of the demon of misfortune is to consume, but the function of Christ is to restore. However, this restoration doesn't happen automatically. It's a spiritual choice. It takes discernment to recognize the workings of darkness and courage not to submit to them. Because the enemy doesn't fear those who pray out of habit, he fears those who pray with understanding. Many live in cycles of destruction without realizing there is a spiritual force behind it. They lose relationships, jobs, emotional health, purpose, and think it's just bad luck. But bad luck is the modern name given to what the spiritual world has identified millennia ago: demonic influence. The demon of misfortune operates in areas where there is spiritual neglect. Where faith grows cold, where the heart becomes skeptical, it transforms the home into a battlefield, the mind into a prison, and the future into a shadow. And that is why discernment is vital. This is not about superstition, but about spiritual understanding. Ruin begins when man stops fighting in the invisible realm, because war is real and neutrality is an illusion. The demon of misfortune is the same one that rejoices when man forgets that he can resist. He doesn't just want to destroy the body, he wants to steal the soul's conviction. And perhaps, as you listen to this, something within you identifies with it. Perhaps you have felt this weight, this sequence of losses, this feeling that something is draining your strength. Perhaps you have thought, why does everything go wrong for me? And that is exactly the question the demon of misfortune wants you to repeat. Because when you say that, you prophesy over yourself. But there is a spiritual secret. Misfortune feeds on what you declare. Hell is strengthened by your discouragement, but weakened by your resistance. If this message makes sense to you, I want you to write a specific sentence in the comments. I am not a territory of misfortune. Write this down now, because when you declare it, you cut off the invisible influence of that spirit. I want to see who has understood the power of this revelation and will affirm this truth in faith. The true battlefield has never been the world outside. It is within. It is silent, invisible, but fierce. Man is the battlefield where it is decided who rules, light or darkness. It is within the mind, within the heart, that spiritual forces wage their most intense wars. Misfortune, that sequence of losses, pains, and ruins, does not spring from the outside. It begins as a seed planted within, a spiritual seed that germinates when it finds the fertile soil of the soul's cracks. And these cracks aren't always visible. They disguise themselves as common feelings. A little envy here, a dose of pride there, a harbored resentment, a guilt that was never confessed. All of this seems small, but it's enough to create space. It's through this crack that the enemy enters. He doesn't invade forcefully, he enters subtly. He settles where there is bitterness, feeds on anger, grows on indifference. He knows that man rarely notices the moment he begins to be taken over. The human soul is like a spiritual fortress. When it is whole, evil finds no access. But when the heart is divided, when the mind is filled with contradictory voices, when the spirit weakens, the field becomes vulnerable. It is at that moment that misfortune begins. First as confused thoughts, then as impulsive actions, and finally as concrete destruction. Misfortune is not the end, it is the result of a process. It is the reflection of a war that man has ceased to fight within himself. The enemy knows this. He doesn't need to attack directly. He simply observes and waits. He waits for envy to grow, for pride to blind, for guilt to silence prayer. He knows the power of self-neglect. When a man stops watching, the enemy plants. When a man begins to justify his mistakes, the enemy waters. When a man convinces himself that he is fine, even far from God, the enemy harvests. It's an invisible cycle, and the cruelest part is that everything seems normal. Many look at suffering and say, God has abandoned me. But they don't realize that the abandonment began within them when they stopped guarding their hearts. Because the human heart is the altar where God dwells. And when that altar is profaned by feelings contrary to the light, it becomes neutral ground, and neutral ground is enemy territory. No ruin begins outside. All destruction begins silently, within. Look around. How many people do you know who seem alive but are empty inside? How many say, I'm fine, but hide within themselves the weight of guilt, envy, hatred, and comparison? These emotions are spiritual gateways. Every time you feed envy, you take a step towards ruin. Every time you choose pride instead of forgiveness, you reinforce the dominion of darkness. Every time you blame others instead of looking inward, you hand the enemy the key to your own territory. Spiritual misfortune is a consented invasion. It doesn't happen without permission. And the most frightening thing is that this permission doesn't need to be verbal. Silence is enough. Silence in the face of error, silence in the face of lack of faith, silence in the face of a conscience that no longer speaks. Evil enters when man stops fighting, not when the enemy attacks. That is why Jesus always warned, watch and pray. He wasn't just talking about external danger, but about internal danger. Because the enemy only wins where he finds permission. He cannot rule what is protected by light, but if man opens breaches, even small ones, he enters and makes his home. And the process is so subtle that many only realize it when they are already overcome by despair. Some people say, I don't know what happened, everything suddenly started going wrong. But nothing happens suddenly. The fall is always gradual. First comes spiritual discouragement, then coldness, then disobedience. And when the heart is far from God, evil doesn't need to push, it only needs to whisper, and the person falls on their own. The human mind is the most strategic field in the spiritual universe. It is there that the enemy launches his darts. Thoughts of defeat, doubt, fear, envy, each one is a projectile seeking to penetrate the shield of faith. When a person believes a lie, they give it power. Therefore, the enemy doesn't need strength, he only needs credibility. And he gains that when a person begins to doubt God's presence. The Bible shows that the war is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. These spiritual powers do not dwell in heaven or on earth, but within the hearts that harbor them. They feed on emotional energy, anger, hatred, and fear. Every time you lose control over your emotions, you cede territory. And the more territory the enemy occupies within you, the more the exterior begins to crumble. There are people who keep repeating the same cycles. They miss opportunities, get involved in destructive relationships, and always fall into the same traps. And they ask themselves, why does this always happen to me? The answer is spiritual. Because there is an untreated breach, an unhealed wound, an unpurified feeling. As long as man does not close the doors of his soul, misfortune will have free access. That's why self-examination is a powerful weapon. When you look at yourself honestly, without masks, without justifications, the enemy loses power. The light exposes what the darkness hides. The first step to overcoming misfortune is recognizing where it began, within, and that requires courage. Because looking inward is confronting your own shadows, but it is there, in that silent confrontation, that liberation begins. The soul is the most precious territory that exists, and at the same time, the most vulnerable. Whoever controls their emotions controls their spiritual life. Whoever lets anger rule paves the way for ruin. Whoever feeds pride closes the door to grace. Whoever carries guilt without repentance lives imprisoned in the past. The demon of misfortune needs do nothing more than observe and take advantage of what man himself offers. Think about it. How many times have you felt anger and couldn't let go? How many times have you compared your life to others and felt envy, even without admitting it? How many times have you preferred to appear strong when you were actually broken inside? These are the moments when the enemy approaches. He doesn't fear the weak man. He fears the man who recognizes his weakness, because humility is the key that closes spiritual breaches. If this message resonated with you, I want you to comment with a specific phrase to help it stick in your mind. I am a territory of light. Write this down. Declare it in the comments. Because every spiritual war begins with words, and so does every victory. Each comment is an affirmation of faith against ruin, an act of resistance against the invisible enemy. I want to see who understands the depth of this. Pain is a spiritual language. Do you understand it? And that's why many get lost in the midst of misfortune. When chaos sets in, the first human impulse is to ask why. But the Bible reveals that not all ruin is punishment. Sometimes it's a lesson. It's as if God himself lights the fire to burn away pride, fear, and dependence on the things of this world. Misfortune, when seen through the eyes of the flesh, seems like the end, but through the eyes of faith, it is the beginning of a sacred process of purification. Job is the cruelest, and at the same time, most divine mirror of this mystery. He lost everything, not because God hated him, but because he loved him enough to reveal him to himself. God allowed Satan to touch his life, not to destroy him, but to expose the gold that was hidden beneath the dust of his self-sufficiency. It is at this point that many fail. They confuse the test with punishment, the trial with abandonment. When the fire burns, the soul groans, and the enemy whispers, "God has forgotten you." But the silence of heaven is sometimes the sound of a work being done. It is the moment when faith is put to the test, when the human mind is stripped of all certainties and the spirit is forced to choose, to trust or to curse. Misfortune is a spiritual mirror. It reveals what was hidden, what success disguised, what routine covered up. When everything is going well, the human heart becomes blind, proud, autonomous. It's easy to worship when there's bread on the table, when the body is healthy, when plans come to fruition. But when ruin arrives, when the ground disappears, that's when we discover in whom we truly trust. God allows chaos not to destroy us, but to reveal what comfort has hidden. Because it is in pain that masks fall, and the true face of faith appears. Every tear shed before divine silence is a seed of transformation. Evil tries to steal this process, tries to convince man that there is no purpose in suffering, but the Holy Spirit acts precisely in the midst of pain, teaching lessons that no book could contain. The divine lesson is profound. The same fire that destroys the straw purifies the gold. Suffering is the crucible of the soul. It melts pride, consumes vanity, and reveals the essence. When God allows misfortune, he is not being cruel. He is purifying the vessel. Misfortune is not a sign of rejection, but a call for correction. What seems like loss is often preparation. What seems like punishment is sometimes spiritual advancement. Job, at the height of his misery, heard his wife say, "Curse God and die." But he responded with something that echoes to this day. Shall we indeed receive good from God and not evil? This phrase reveals the heart of the true worshipper, one who understands that God is sovereign both in days of celebration and in days of mourning. And that's where the paradox becomes divine. The same fire that destroys the wicked purifies the righteous. The difference lies not in the intensity of the pain, but in the heart's response. For some, suffering is imprisonment. For others, it is liberation. When man tries to escape misfortune at all costs, he loses the opportunity to be molded. When he accepts the process, even without understanding, heaven opens above him. God does not want perfect hearts, but malleable hearts. Misfortune breaks man, so that God may remake him in his image. Therefore, often the greatest blessing comes disguised as tragedy. And what the enemy planned to destroy, God transforms into a stage of revelation. This is the great spiritual irony. The devil works to wound, but God uses the wound to heal. Evil wants to bury, but God uses the same hole to plant. That is why true discernment is not seeing what the eyes see, but perceiving what God is doing in silence. The spiritual man does not flee from pain. He deciphers it. He understands that something is being shaped in the invisible and that suffering has a hidden code. Each tear is a letter of that code. Each sleepless night is a line written in the book of celestial learning. And when the fire goes out, what remains is a lighter, more lucid human being, more prepared to understand the secrets of the kingdom. God does not delight in misfortune, but he permits it because he knows the frailty of the flesh and the strength of the spirit. He knows that there are pains that save. He allows man to descend to dust so that pride may die and the spirit may bow down. And when the soul understands this, hell loses its power. Because the demon of misfortune lives on human despair, on the inability to see meaning in chaos. When man realizes that suffering can be a divine tool, hell trembles, for pain ceases to be the domain of the enemy and becomes an instrument of the Creator. Misfortune, therefore, is a sacred school, one that few choose to attend, but all are invited to enter at some point. Every crisis, every loss, every tear is a lesson about the invisible. God does not waste suffering. And while the enemy works to sow fear and despair, God plants wisdom and resilience. The man who emerges from the fire is not the same as the one who went in. Something in him dies, yes, but what dies is what prevented the spirit from growing. The gold that comes out of the furnace is purer, more valuable, stronger. And this is where I want you to reflect. What is your misfortune trying to teach you? What is the fire of your pain burning inside you? Isn't that exactly what God is trying to show you? That there is something deeper behind the ruin, a purpose hidden beneath the ashes. Comment below what you've understood so far. Write "purifying fire" if you believe that even pain can be used by God for good. And if this message is opening your spiritual eyes, like it now and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will make you see suffering in a new light, the light of divine revelation. It is at this point in the journey that something changes. The pain has already burned away what needed to be burned, and God's silence, previously interpreted as abandonment, begins to be understood as preparation. Man, once blinded by despair, now begins to see. But not with the eyes of the flesh, with the eyes of the spirit. It is the moment when the veil is torn, when the human mind, for the first time, realizes that the true war was never visible. The misfortune, the chaos, the ruin, all that seemed only suffering begins to reveal a hidden spiritual meaning. It is as if a lamp is lit within the soul. The heart that once cried out, "Why?" now whispers, "I understand." This is the awakening, the moment when man realizes that he has always been in the midst of a spiritual war, even without knowing it. Jesus warned, "In this world you will have trouble, But take heart, I have overcome the world. John 16:33. He didn't promise the absence of pain, but victory over it. And Paul, in Ephesians 6:12, made it clear that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. These words gain weight when the soul awakens, when a person understands that betrayal, that loss, that financial collapse, that deep depression, none of it was merely chance. They were invisible arrows, fired from a field that human eyes cannot see. The enemy acts in the darkness, camouflaged in circumstances, disguised as coincidence. But when the spirit awakens, the illusion is shattered. The person realizes that there is a dark intelligence operating behind the misfortune, trying to extinguish the light of faith. And it is at that moment that faith is reborn, no longer a fragile faith, built on what is visible, but a faith forged in the midst of war. This spiritual awakening is painful, but it is liberating. It's as if the soul finally opens its eyes and sees the whole picture. Suffering ceases to be a punishment and becomes a calling. Fear loses its power because now man understands that the enemy only attacks what has value. And if he has been the target of so much suffering, it is because he carries something precious. The demon of misfortune does not pursue emptiness, he pursues purpose. He tries to extinguish what is light, tries to silence what has a voice, tries to corrupt what has been chosen. When man awakens, he realizes this. He realizes that the enemy has always been more interested in his mind than in his possessions, more interested in his faith than in his fortune. Because the true battlefield is internal, it is within the soul that hell wages its wars. And when this awareness takes hold, life is never the same again. Old pains gain new meaning. What once seemed like injustice now reveals itself as training. Losses become lessons. Man begins to discern the spiritual in everyday life. He understands that nothing is random, that every detail carries a hidden purpose. He realizes that there are times when the enemy acts with fury because he knows that something great is about to be born. Therefore, the greater the attack, the greater the revelation that approaches. Awakening makes man stop complaining and start interpreting. He stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and starts asking, "What is God trying to show me through this?" That's when hell loses ground, because pain ceases to generate despair and begins to generate wisdom. The spiritual mind sees the invisible, and when the invisible becomes clear, fear disappears. Man understands that he is not being punished, he is being prepared. That what the enemy uses to hurt, God transforms into a stepping stone. It's as if each tear shed becomes a lens that amplifies vision. The more man cries, the more he sees. Awakening is this: pain becoming vision, suffering becoming wisdom, chaos becoming revelation, and what was once darkness now becomes a kind of spiritual map, a guide that shows where the enemy tried to act and where God silently intervened. This new perspective is not achieved through intelligence, but through surrender. Man only sees the invisible when he gives up trying to control the visible. The awakened soul begins to perceive how subtly the enemy acts. He doesn't come with horns and fire, but with thoughts, distractions, fears, and guilt. He plants ideas, distorts realities, makes man feel forgotten, unworthy, defeated. It's a mental war fought behind the scenes of consciousness. But those with discernment perceive each negative thought, each impulse to give up, each feeling of emptiness is a spiritual arrow. And it is at this point that the Holy Spirit begins to act powerfully. He illuminates the interior, reveals the adversary's strategies, and awakens the authority that man has always had but never used. Awakening is when man discovers that he is not a victim, but a soldier, that he is not condemned, but is being trained, that he is not being destroyed, but is being shaped. It is in this state of consciousness that faith is reborn, not the childish faith that only believes when everything is going well, but the mature faith that trusts even without understanding. This faith is forged in darkness, in the nights when man feels alone, but still decides to believe. It is the faith that looks at the invisible and says, "Even if I don't see, I know that God is acting." And this faith is unshakable because it is born from awakening. Misfortune, which before seemed like a curse, becomes the catalyst for spiritual rebirth. The awakened soul understands that hell may roar, but it cannot overcome a heart that has understood who it is in God. That is why, when man awakens, the enemy retreats. He loses control over those who already see the invisible. And I want you to think about this now. How many times have you thought you were being destroyed when in reality you were being awakened? How many times has God taken you out of something not because He wanted to punish you, but because He wanted to open your eyes? Suffering is the gateway to spiritual vision. Comment below if you've ever experienced a moment like this, where pain made you see what you couldn't see before. Write in the comments, "I have awakened," if this message spoke to you, if you now understand that the struggle was never carnal, but spiritual. And if this message makes sense to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because in the next chapter you will understand what really happens when the soul awakens, and hell realizes it has lost control. When man awakens to the invisible war, something inevitable happens. The enemy reacts. Because spiritual awakening is not the end of the battle, it is the beginning of a conscious war. Hell stirs when someone decides to fight, but it is precisely at this moment that the spiritual counterattack begins. Evil only prospers in ignorance. It lives on distraction, negligence, and forgetfulness. When the mind is enlightened and the soul takes a stand, demonic dominion begins to crumble. The devil fears the light because the light exposes. He cannot bear it when the truth is proclaimed, when man returns to using the spiritual weapons that God Himself has placed at his disposal. And it is about these weapons that we need to speak, because they are not symbolic. They are real, powerful, and capable of breaking cycles of misfortune that span generations. The first weapon is the prayer, but not mechanical, empty, memorized prayer. It is the prayer that tears the veil of the soul, the one that is born of repentance and truth. The enemy does not fear words, he fears surrender. Prayer is the sword of faith. When a person truly prays, they change the atmosphere around them. Each sincere word rises like fire before God and illuminates the spaces that the enemy tries to keep in darkness. When a person bends their knee, hell trembles, because prayer is the declaration of dependence, and pride is the enemy's favorite terrain. He reigns where there is self-sufficiency, but flees from where there is surrender. The heart that prays is unreachable, because the Spirit dwells within it. Therefore, when misfortune repeats itself, when everything begins to crumble without explanation, the first movement is spiritual, to speak again with God, not to ask for explanations, but to recover the bond that evil tried to break. The second weapon is the fast. Few understand the power of this. Fasting is not a physical penance, it is a war of self-control. When a person fasts, they silence the flesh to hear the spirit. They renounce control, disarm the ego, and weaken the hold of the wills that the enemy uses to manipulate. The demon of misfortune feeds on excess, gluttony, vanity, pride, unbridled pleasure. Fasting cuts off the fuel of darkness. It cleanses the spiritual channels and restores the sensitivity of the soul. It is as if, with each renunciation, a fortress is brought down within us. The body feels weak, but the spirit is strengthened. That is why many cannot fast, because hell knows what happens when a person is silent before God. Fasting is sacred silence, and in that silence, God speaks. The third weapon is the confession, and here is a profound spiritual secret. Evil operates in the shadows. It thrives on what man hides. Every hidden sin is an open door, an invitation for misfortune to enter and remain. But when a man confesses, not to expose himself but to liberate himself, the power of the enemy is broken. The light of truth disarms the darkness. To confess is to say, I will no longer hide what the enemy uses against me. And at that instant, the cycle is broken. Hell hates confession because it destroys the disguise. The demon of guilt, which whispers in the mind, loses authority when a man speaks the truth before God. It is confession that cleanses the spiritual field so that the Holy Spirit may dwell fully again. The man who remains silent feeds shame. The man who confesses feeds freedom. The fourth weapon is the light, the revealed truth, the awakened conscience, the Word of God. It is the lamp that exposes the enemy and disarms his illusions. Evil fears the light because it nullifies manipulation. Every misfortune begins with a lie. You are alone. God has forgotten you. There is no way out. But when man returns to the Word, he finds the antidote. Truth is the fatal blow against deception. The Bible is the mirror that shows who truly governs reality, not chaos, but Christ. When man begins to declare the Word, the spiritual environment changes. The enemy cannot bear to hear the truth because it reminds him of his defeat. He knows he has been defeated, but while man forgets this, the enemy acts. When man remembers, the devil loses his right. And that is why light is essential, because it prevents man from falling into the same traps again. These four weapons, prayer, fasting, confession, and light, form the invisible shield that breaks the cycle of misfortune. But the secret is not in using them only occasionally. The power lies in constancy. The enemy is patient. He waits for weariness, distraction, carelessness. Therefore, the spiritual man needs to be constantly vigilant. The counterattack is not an event. It is a lifestyle. Each day is a battlefield. Today's victory does not guarantee tomorrow's, and that is why vigilance is the greatest proof of faith. Evil does not fear the religious person who only speaks, but trembles before the spiritual person who lives what he believes. Spiritual counterattack also requires discernment. It's no use fighting the effect if you don't attack the cause. Man needs to understand where the enemy has infiltrated. Sometimes it's in an unforgiven word, a harbored resentment, a never-healed hurt. Evil enters through emotional breaches because it has no power over those who live in the light. Therefore, forgiveness is another form of spiritual attack. When man forgives, he closes doors. When he loves, he disarms hell. When he prays for those who have hurt him, he breaks the dominion of hatred. The demon of misfortune cannot withstand forgiveness because forgiveness is the image of God acting within man. And where God acts, darkness cannot resist. There is also the power of, in the name of Jesus. This is the ultimate authority. No demon, no curse, no force of ruin can stand before this name. The awakened man learns to declare with faith, in the name of Jesus, I break this cycle. And it is not superstition. It is a spiritual decree. The enemy recognizes authority, and authority is not earned, it is assumed. When a man understands who he is in Christ, he ceases to be a victim and becomes a warrior. And that is when hell retreats, because it does not fear those who shout, it fears those who know who they are. And perhaps now, as you listen to this, you are remembering areas of your life where chaos seems constant. A pattern of losses, illnesses, broken relationships. Perhaps the enemy has convinced you that it's bad luck, fate, karma. But the truth is that there are spiritual forces at work, just waiting for you to take a stand. The cycle of misfortune only continues where there is passivity. When the soul awakens, the dominion ends. Prayer cleanses the environment. Fasting silences the flesh. Confession breaks the shame. Light destroys the lie. And when all this aligns, evil is exposed, and what is exposed is defeated. Now I want to challenge you to reflect. Which of these weapons do you need to reactivate? The prayer that has grown cold? The fast you abandoned? A confession you haven't yet had the courage to make? Or perhaps the light, the time to return to the Word and nourish yourself with truth? Write the phrase in the comments below. I am in a spiritual war. If this message woke you up, share this video with someone who is living through a cycle of misfortune and needs to understand that there are real spiritual weapons to break free. And also comment, I will fight back. Because when you declare this, hell hears it and heaven records it. There comes a moment when suffering ceases to be mere pain and transforms into revelation. It is at that instant that man understands that evil never had the power to conquer, only to test. Misfortune, however cruel it may seem, is the stage where faith shows whether it is genuine or merely an appearance. It is the place where masks fall, where pride crumbles, and where the essence of the soul is revealed before God. Hell believes it can destroy, but God allows chaos not to annihilate, but to purify. It is the fire that separates the gold from the impurity. And he who endures the fire, he who does not flee from the desert, becomes untouchable, because he emerges from it not as a victim, but as a witness. Suffering, when viewed with carnal eyes, seems like injustice, but with spiritual eyes, it is a process, a training ground for faith. No warrior is formed in times of peace. Pain is the hammer that forges conviction. When a man suffers and does not give up, he proves not only to the world, but to hell itself, that his faith is not one of convenience, it is one of covenant. Evil fears the man who suffers and remains standing, because it knows that the strength of one who does not abandon God, even in the midst of ruin, is indestructible. Think about how many times your life has crumbled, and yet you kept breathing. How many times the enemy mocked your faith, believing he would see you fall completely. And yet, something within you remained lit. That flame is proof that misfortune is not the end. It is the refinement of the soul. The enemy thinks he destroys, but unknowingly, he only accelerates the purpose. Every fall you overcame, every tear you dried, every silence you endured without blaspheming, all of this is being recounted before God as testimony. Suffering is the furnace where the spirit is refined until it shines. Evil does not win because it does not understand the power of purpose. It destroys out of hatred, but God rebuilds out of love. The enemy attacks to uproot faith, but God allows it to strengthen the root. It is a divine paradox. The same fire that burns is the fire that purifies, and it is precisely in this clash between pain and faith that what we call transcendence is born. When man realizes that he is no longer the same, when he understands that he no longer lives for what he has lost, but for what he has discovered within the loss. The final revelation is this: suffering is the language heaven uses to speak to the chosen. God does not waste pain. Every tear is a verse written in the book of your history, and no matter how much the enemy tries to make you doubt, the truth is that there is glory hidden in misfortune. The problem is that few remain long enough to see it. Many give up before the turning point. Many curse the fire before realizing that it was the fire that was burning what needed to die. Suffering reveals not only who you are, but who God is within you. When everything around you falls apart, and yet you feel peace, it's because something supernatural is being formed within you. Hell doesn't understand this. It doesn't understand how someone can be in ruins and still say, I trust in God. That's why evil never wins, because it cannot understand love. And whoever understands love understands the purpose of suffering. John 16:33 says, In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. Notice, Jesus doesn't promise the absence of pain. He promises victory within it. This is the core of the gospel of fire. The Christian is not spared from chaos, he is sustained within it. Evil tries to destroy, but ends up revealing those who truly belong to the light. This is what the demon of misfortune never understands. The more he attacks, the more the righteous mature. The more he tries to extinguish, the more the spirit blows. Suffering also has the power to reorder the heart. It teaches you to detach yourself from what is temporary and to value what is eternal. When a person loses everything, they understand that they never had control. And it is at this point that true faith is born, when the why gives way to the what for. It's no longer about understanding the pain, it's about going through it with purpose. Because whoever crosses the desert holding God's hand discovers that the desert was not punishment, it was a journey. Evil cannot win because faith is something it cannot touch. It can touch the flesh, the house, possessions, the people around, but it cannot touch the purpose. The purpose is sacred. It is written, sealed in the Spirit. That is why, even when everything falls apart, the man who has faith remains standing, because what sustains him is not what he sees, but what he believes. And that is the weapon most feared by hell. The demon of misfortune tries to convince man that suffering is a sign of abandonment. But God uses suffering to reveal his presence. When everything collapses and you still feel peace, when the world is silent and something inside you still tells you endure, that something is God himself speaking to you. Misfortune then ceases to be misfortune. It becomes a stage for revelation. Suffering is not the end, it is the lens through which the eternal manifests itself. Think of Job, the most tested man in history. Everything was taken from him. But in the end he could say, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." That is the ultimate revelation of suffering. It makes man see the invisible. Pain opens a dimension that comfort could never reveal, and whoever sees the invisible becomes invincible. Pain is the altar where man decides which side he is on, because in times of abundance it is easy to say, "I believe," but it is in times of emptiness that faith proves true. God does not seek those who only praise him in good times. He seeks those who recognize him in the midst of the storm, and when man recognizes him there, evil is defeated, because faith remains, and where there is faith, hell has no place. Suffering, therefore, is not the end of the road. It is the place where God reveals who truly trusts. It is where the soul learns the weight of eternity. It is where man understands that it is not pain that defines him, but what he does with it. Every tear is a testimony, every scar is a seal of spiritual survival, and every fall overcome is a humiliation to hell. Because the enemy cannot bear to see someone who has been wounded continue to believe. Now tell me in the comments, how many times have you survived what was meant to destroy you? How many times has hell seen you fall, but seen you rise again? Write the phrase below. Evil does not win. If you believe that the suffering you endured was not in vain, and if this message resonated with you, please also comment. My faith was forged in fire. These words have power. They declare that even when evil shouts, God's purpose still speaks louder. What if that's exactly it? What if your misfortune is the field where God teaches you to overcome the demon that persecutes you? Think about it. What if everything that went wrong in your life, everything that made you fall, everything that brought you to tears and left you silent, wasn't punishment, but training? Because the enemy only pursues those who have a destiny. He doesn't pursue those who are empty. He's not bothered by those who live in the comfort of indifference. He targets precisely those who have a spiritual purpose, those who carry a promise, those who, even wounded, still have faith. And perhaps what you're calling misfortune is the very battlefield where God is teaching you to fight, to discern, to resist, to recognize his voice in the midst of chaos. How many times have you asked for strength and God gave you a war? How many times have you prayed for wisdom and God placed you before an abyss? That's how He works. He doesn't give you ready-made answers. He gives you scenarios that shape your soul, because faith doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in the tension between fear and hope. It's when everything seems lost that the Spirit whispers, "Stand firm. This is only the beginning of your learning." And that's when hell despairs, because what it planned to destroy you ends up becoming the same instrument that awakens you spiritually. The demon behind the misfortune wants to convince you that God has abandoned you. He whispers that nothing makes sense, that prayer is useless, that your faith is a waste of time. But what he fears is exactly the opposite. He knows that if you continue to believe even without understanding, you will become a threat. Because the power of those who trust in the midst of pain is something that hell cannot contain. It's like a light that evil cannot extinguish. That's why he tries to distort your vision, tries to make you look at the chaos and see only tragedy. But what if the chaos is a disguise for a greater plan? What if the desert itself is preparing you for a promised land that you cannot yet imagine? Remember how many times you survived the impossible, how many times everything seemed hopeless, and somehow a door opened. That wasn't by chance. It was divine permission. Because suffering is a school, and God is the teacher who teaches you lessons that aren't learned in times of peace. He teaches you patience when you lose control, humility when you are humiliated, faith when you are left alone. He teaches you to trust without seeing, to persevere without understanding. And when man reaches that point, evil loses its power. The demon of misfortune cannot dominate those who have learned to read the meaning of suffering. He tries to transform your pain into despair, but God transforms your pain into direction. With each fall, He repositions you. With each tear, He purifies you. With each silence, He draws you closer to Him. Because it is in silence that the Spirit speaks loudest. It is there, when the whole world seems to have forgotten you, that God works in the invisible, assembling the pieces of your new beginning. What if, while you complain about misfortune, heaven is celebrating your progress? Because every time you endure without murmuring, hell is ashamed. Every time you continue praying even when tired, the enemy loses ground. Your resistance is an affront to evil. The demon of misfortune wants to break you, but he doesn't understand that you were made to resist. He doesn't understand that there is a spirit within you that does not bend, that does not give up, that does not surrender. What you call suffering may be the laboratory where God is teaching you to master what once mastered you. He teaches you to discern, to forgive, to see the spiritual behind the natural. He teaches you that your strength lies not in your ability, but in your surrender. Because when man understands that it is not he who wins, but God within him, evil becomes powerless. What if your misfortune is the field where God is training you to liberate others? Because whoever learns to overcome the demon that persecutes them also learns to break chains in other lives. God doesn't waste pain. Every wound has a purpose. Perhaps today you are experiencing something you don't understand, but tomorrow it will be your experience that liberates someone. Suffering gives you spiritual authority. It makes you dangerous to hell because it transforms your pain into testimony. And what the enemy fears most is a man who has been wounded but has not lost his faith. Because he knows that this man no longer fights with the strength of the flesh, but with the strength of the Spirit. He knows that this man carries fire in his eyes and purpose in his heart. He knows that no evil can stop someone who has already been through the furnace and come out stronger. That is why he tries to convince you that your struggle is useless, but it is not. Your struggle is the field where God is molding you for victory. What if it is precisely now, in this moment of weariness, that God is preparing your rebirth? What if what seems like the end is the beginning of your spiritual authority? Your misfortune is not defeat, it is a process, and those who understand the process do not despair because they know there is a hidden plan behind the pain. So answer me this: how many times has hell thought it had defeated you, only to see you rise again? How many times has your faith been tested and, even if small, remained alive? This is a sign that the Spirit still dwells within you. Evil does not win. Misfortune does not define the end. It only reveals the extent of your spiritual resilience. Now I want you to reflect deeply. What if your pain is the training ground that will teach you to confront the very demon that tried to destroy your lineage? What if what you are experiencing is the path that will lead you to the liberation of your home, your family, your history? Because the truth is this: God did not create you to be a victim of misfortune. He created you to be a witness to overcoming it. And that's why I'm asking you this question. Not to unsettle you, but to awaken you. What if your misfortune is the field where God teaches you to overcome the demon that haunts you? Think about it and answer me in the comments. What was your greatest challenge and what did it teach you? I want to read your story because it can awaken faith in someone who needs to hear it. Also write down the phrase, "My pain has a purpose," so that hell knows you understood the process. And if this message made sense to you, leave your like now, subscribe to the channel and share this video, because evil doesn't win when the truth is revealed.